be informal, I think, reasonably, although we do want to present some material today. And what I should say in advance is that there's an awful lot of material in this inquiry. And I'm not going to try and shove it down your throats today. What I was thinking we would do, the three of us, and we'll swap around a bit so that you don't just get bored of one voice, particularly mine, hopefully. But the idea is to try to give you a tasting plate, I guess, a bit of an entree. And there's tons online. We will put this presentation online after today, so you don't need to, you know, photograph it and take notes. I mean, you're welcome to, but that material will be available. I wanted to start by saying that we actually had a circular housing system in Australia up until about 200 years ago, that's when things started going pear-shaped. The buildings that existed were dismantled and repurposed. Plenty of books on this subject now. Sometimes those were quite deliberate, those practices. There was this idea of evidencing there was nothing here and no settlement, terra nullis, etc. So an erasure of permanent settlements. But also materials were repurposed into colonial buildings. And soon enough then large tracts of lands were being bulldozed and houses were built and hooked up to growing gas and electricity grids. This all became, quite normalised, so that today it's actually quite a challenge to imagine any other way than fossil-dependent, single-use. Each house is tied by an umbilical cord of gas and electricity into, hardwired, if you like, into fossil grids, and is a churning site of consumption with new kitchens and bathrooms arriving every few years, etc., etc. This is something that has become not just part of the popular imaginary, but embedded. It's hard to do anything else. So I'm not talking about a return to a pre-colonial era or housing vernacular or anything like that. I'm saying that Aboriginal knowledge is valuable as we forge a circular economy housing future, but it's also important to acknowledge that we're on Aboriginal land. And in fact, I think we've got a formal, I would like to myself acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that we are gathered today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And of course, or importantly, note that this land was never ceded and therefore remains Aboriginal land. And I think that, I think it's important in thinking about housing futures that are more circular to acknowledge you can't have housing without land. That sounds a bit obvious. So I'm going to stay off script for a couple more minutes. First, the gas ban. I can't help saying something about the gas ban. I must say it's a bold social program that is being foreshadowed by the Victorian government's announcement on not having gas connections for new housing from 2024 onwards. Given that anybody who's seen MasterChef would see a hyper-gas kitchen, and we are all really being influenced by visions, models, exemplars of intensive gas domestic lives. I would have liked to have seen a couple of seasons of electric-only MasterChef showing how wonderful this life is and how this kitchen functions before we go into really switching stuff off or not connecting things. I do think we have to think more broadly about the soft power dimensions. Not that I'm not supporting the idea that that disconnecting at least natural gas is a stepping stone towards circular economy housing. Of course it is. The question is the how and the who and the where and the when. And secondly, I'd like to go back to 2005 briefly, because that was the year I arrived in Australia. One of the first things I did with colleagues was I was commissioned by the Australian Greenhouse Office. Yes, we used to have one, to do an international comparison of housing performance, which involved getting house plans from US and Europe in climate zones that were mappable to Australian climate zones, modelling them and seeing what they look like in Australian NatHERS, if you like, ratings, to find out whether going to 5-star was going to be crippling our economy, as some commentators suggested. And in fact, we found that the average of all these bog standard, no green housing, just bog standard housing built to codes overseas was over 7 stars, 7.3. This was in 2005. We've been behind the rest of the Western world, and I don't just mean Europe. US, not known for its green housing codes, has been miles ahead of us by 40%. So we're producing 40% more greenhouse gas emissions. We're still not at 7 stars. Government has just announced another delay on implementing pre-2005 basic regulations across the US. That's where we're at. So that's the hill we've got to climb. And those 50,000 or so families that are going to be moving into houses that are not 7 stars as a result of this delay are going to pay higher bills for the next 50 years. That's the kind of costs we've got to factor into these kinds of decisions. So I think I just wanted to make those polemic points as a precursor, because what I'm going to say and we're going to say over the next few minutes is that there's a lot of elements to this circular economy housing, but overarching, I would say it means leadership. And I'll come on to what I mean by that and why. Leadership everywhere, but particularly leadership in setting the rules of the playing field, because that's what de-risks investment, and that's what de-risks, well, investment in all kinds of ways, financial, training, you name it. So our rationale is pretty straightforward. I think I'm preaching to a converted audience, so I'm going to move quite quickly through these slides now. Needless to say, we're nowhere near circular economy housing, and we've got a long way to go. Existing strategies must fundamentally change because they're not moving us towards circular economy housing at anything like the rate required. And what is circular economy? Our definition that we use for the inquiry was taken from the literature and is broader than a material definition. It includes prioritising local employment, resilient and functional design. It involves thinking about equity and access to affordable housing. So these are included within our broad definition of circular economy housing. I'm probably not going to talk to this slide much other than to say that there are an array of instruments, but these, which are often tied to, in essence, that regulatory framework that I foreshadowed, are key starting points. The industry, and I can see some industry players here, can't do this by themselves. That has been proven through the self-regulatory approach we've taken over the last 20 years. And I think I can probably skip this slide. In a sense, the other part of this is that it requires everybody to do something, but as part of a set of coordinated activities. So our goal in terms of the inquiry was to address this question. How could a transition to a circular economy in housing be implemented to provide more sustainable housing? That was the question we were in effect given by AHURI. And there were 4 separate research projects, discrete projects, plus the overarching inquiry itself that had to fit together in order to address this question. So this is broadly giving you an idea of those 4 projects. Each was led by a different university. There were other universities involved, like University of Wollongong was involved, for example, in Project D. And then, of course, the inquiry was led by myself and a team at RMIT. There were cross-cutting questions that we gave to each project and to ourselves in the inquiry team. So if you can imagine those verticals, there were these as horizontal questions running through every single project. How are housing producers organised? What drives and dynamics are critical in shifting demand? What needs and opportunities are there for workforce training? What are the key innovation challenges and opportunities, and what financial, fiscal and regulatory and policy instruments are used? So these were used in each of these: the planning, the apartments, the social housing retrofit, and the building materials projects, the 4 projects. Methods we used were a variety of secondary, international lit reviews and so on, and also primary empirical work where there were focus groups, there were interviews undertaken, online surveys, case studies. So a mixture of different methods across the 5 key activities. And that did enable us to dip in to what's happening around the world, which I think is always useful to do, even though conditions are always different in different locales. Just do a quick time check. The inquiry was conducted over basically 2 years. We commenced a couple of years ago with some scoping papers. So the 5 scoping papers, each one set those horizontal that I just mentioned. Each of the 5 cross-cutting research questions had a scoping paper commissioned by somebody to write, who then worked across the 4 projects. Then there was a phasing of the 4 projects. So there was a discussion paper, an interim stage, and a panel. There was then the main research phase, data collection phase. Then there was a second discussion paper and panel meeting, and then from there, final reports produced, and the reports are now all available online as of the last 2 or 3 weeks or whatever it is, several weeks. So you can simply go onto the AHURI website, type in circular economy housing, and it'll all show up, and you can download it all for your reading pleasure. I just want to acknowledge the panel members. These were brought in by AHURI, but extremely valuable input into the project at those 2 points that I just mentioned, and provoked interesting discussions, and certainly shifted the course of the inquiry in various different ways. And here's the outputs, which I just mentioned. So 4 inquiry sub-project reports, 2 discussion papers, an inquiry research report, a policy framework. And Louise is going to talk a bit about an interesting and unusual for researchers output that we have, and we want to discuss a bit today. So I won't steal your thunder, Louise. I'll leave that to you to talk about. And I think I'm going to hand over to Julie now for a few minutes to at least listen to a much more nice sounding voice. Thank you.
So, hello everybody. My name is Julie Lawson. I'm adjunct professor here at RMIT Centre for Urban Research. I say here, but I actually live in Europe at the moment. In fact, probably for the last 25 years. But RMIT is definitely my spiritual home, and the Centre for Urban Research is in some way where I always come back to. It's an oasis of diverse disciplines, perspectives, wonderful team of people. So it's always really, really a pleasure to come home to Melbourne and to RMIT in particular. So I should also let you know that what my background is. Probably the most interesting thing for you maybe to learn. I'm the co-editor of Housing Theory and Society, which is researchers you may be wanting to publish in, but also in a policy sense, the lead author of the report Housing 2030, which was the UN report in 2021, which has inspired 56 governments to do better on housing. But to talk about the inquiry framework, one of the things that Ralph mentioned was leadership. Now, leadership without a framework is pretty much chaos. We're all tumbling around, looking at each other, wondering what to do. A framework is a way of organising our activities, our thoughts, our efforts, our energies. And through the process of this inquiry, we realised that there was enormous amount of policy initiatives and changes and reforms and pilots and all kinds of things that could be undertaken. But if we could organise them into a logical, meaningful way, that would really help people to mobilise and understand where they fit and what their role could be. So the inquiry, and bubbling up through discussion, through our reading, through our argy-bargy at our many meetings, also our critical dialogue, because we don't all agree all the time, and I think it's always healthy to have no groupthink, but to actually have a good debate and discussion. We had Hazel Esope, for example, pushes harder on how to think about these things. We had also had others saying, but what about what Mazzucato's thinking? And we had, we've got this great, legend of a emeritus professor here in the RMIT called Mike Berry. He's also talking about different forms of capitalism and how we can actually do better and shape that. So together, having immersed ourselves in all the different types of financial, legal, regulatory approaches, we started to develop a way of thinking about a circular economy strategies. So we proposed this 4-quadrant circular economy of housing approach. The first part is about reappraising value. I might just, there we are. For the first part is about reappraising value. So prioritising, lifting the importance of environmental, ecological and social impacts, also those in the future, to account for them for now. So much broader than the ideas of just narrow GDP or ways in which we measure so-called progress, but taking into account the resources that we utilise, the ones that we waste. So more, if you like, rigorous thinking about value. The second area that is also, if you like, about seeing market processes or markets themselves as something of which we are integrally responsible for shaping. That we are not seeing markets as something which we step aside and let the magic hand or the invisible hand, etc., but a much more alert recognition is that the markets we have are the ones in which we have, if you like, created the frameworks, the regulations, etc. for. And we know that we have created markets which have been wasteful, which use resources which are finite, which have led to a throwaway economy. So we need to tilt the way in which, even aggressively tilt in some cases, to support the kind of economy that we are looking to shape better. For example, by banning subsidies to fossil fuels or stopping supporting for fracking, for example. So we need to tilt the market towards the outcomes that we wish. But of course, in doing so, this takes human capacities also. We need to build capacity to do the kind of roles and tasks and perform the kind of activities that we're going to need in urban planning, in construction, in finance, in accounting, in regulating, in all those things. So together, the quadrant framework amounts to a sort of coordination suite of policy and supporting measures across the reports, and is embedded in the strategy which we eventually come up with from the results of the empirical research that are done. Here we are, just reminding ourselves of what reappraising values. and that those values, of course, inform our political leadership, our regulation, our training and sense making of the places and investments and so on, that it is, if you like, embedded throughout. So we're not just going for growth, we're talking about a completely different approach. In shaping markets, so seeing that regulation now has shaped the way in which the markets perform, so we will need to change those regulations for them to perform in a different way. And that will require all kinds of regulation and re-regulation to shape those markets. So regulation is not something which should see that needs to step aside or be diminished, but needs to be reshaped to be good regulation, to be an effective changer of market processes. And again, tilting investment flows. So sometimes a much more direct approach is needed towards to shape or enable or to participate in markets themselves, to be engaged in actually the business of doing the market interactions. So that might mean, in fact, direct investment, particular incentives, certain types of subsidies, choosing to buy certain things, having a procurement policy which favours certain types of purchases. And of course, building capacity. RMIT is an educational institution, of course. Its prime goal is about building capacity. So shaping the way in which we do that, how we embed that in our curriculum, how we inform those in which we're are involved in that learning process, we are a key stakeholder in that. So when we are looking at what do governments actually do to shape these markets, one of the first things we did was do a major international review. And together with Louise, one of the 5 scoping papers was about all the finance regulatory approaches. And this very, very neat little diagram simply summarises what were the main themes in those tools and approaches that we saw in these different country strategies. So what you can see is that regulatory frameworks are the most common, research and development, and also communicating best practices are the most pervasive tools. And there are a number of other additional tools as well. But this doesn't really tell us much. It just tells us what. It doesn't tell us how. And it isn't necessarily relevant to the Australian setting. So we had to go further than that. We also chose to look and see what was happening in Europe. We know that Europe is at the moment probably one of the regions of the world which is doing the most active policy and development work on this topic. And it's not something which is just done in a marginal way. It's actually central to the government's 7-year semester program for what it does in Brussels. So it's central to that period of the European Parliament and the Commission's work for these coming years. You've all heard about the Green Deal, and we know also about the Brussels effect and the way in which that ripples out across the world, in fact, to influence governments and to alter the direction of their thinking. But our research also found that already in 2008, China was actually quite busy with circular economy. In fact, Rwanda has also been busy with circular economy. So there's a very diverse regions of the world, but Europe is certainly getting a lot of airplay and doing a lot. As you can see from the circular diagram, the kind of things that they're busy with. And what is leading that is both the European Parliament, which has accepted the importance and centrality of this concept within their agenda, and also the Commission, which is working to implement that agenda, propose laws and directives, strategies, approaches, invest in research in a significant way, to set the goalposts for finance in ESG taxonomy, to defining the metrics, to what should be measured and how it should be reported. So it's very, very useful for us. It's a very extensive library of information. And it's having an impact. So this is just 4 weeks ago, a report from the European Commission about how extensive the circular economy is in reporting amongst corporations these days, whether it be on recycling, also designing for flexibility and adaptability and future reassembly and use, improving the content and construction products and materials that are used, and improving those. So you can see how they're also increasingly reporting, demonstrating, and measuring. And why are they doing that? Well, because they've been directed to do so. Because there's a plan to an overarching vision, which is saying this is the way we want to go. Because there are definitions which have to be reported on, because they're embedded into financial frameworks. So we know that there are also different frameworks which are relevant to different scales. You heard from Ralph about the way in which we've looked at different fields of action. So in the area of neighbourhoods, we can see that there are examples that we can examine from financial instruments, fiscal instruments, i.e. expenditure, and also regulation guiding, hi Mike, guiding how those markets are to perform within the neighbourhood setting. We see in the example the research by Stephanie Dura and co from South Australia. She investigated 15 case studies, of which 5 of them were overseas cases, in which she looked at how comprehensive integrated planning could be utilised to promote particular outcomes and processes. In the case of Shanawasa Park, which was a former military base by the United States, and how the city, the local city, actually played a very, very leading role in not only taking back the land of that, to taking an assertive role in the actual vision for that city, for that new settlement. It involved 14,000 dwellings, for the way in which it integrated water use and water flows on that site, how they planned for those things in the design and organisation of the trunk infrastructure, but also how they worked to connect that new community by ensuring that there was good public transport and good connectivity, that encouraged walking, that encouraged enjoyment of nature, that involved an appreciation of those values for the people who are going to live there in the future. So this is a great example in Germany of, and it's featured in the report by Stephanie. So I encourage you to have a look at that and go further into the links. We also have a very experimental example from Amsterdam, which is Buiksloterham, which is a very strange name, typical Dutch, long word. But there it's more like a living lab where things are being experimented on, tried out. Mistakes can be made, failure, and learning from. So it's learning by doing, but it's also learning by doing in an environment where the City of Amsterdam says, that's okay, that's what we want you to do. We will support you through our land policy, through ensuring they've got the space and the time to adapt, to learn, to try it out. And we'll also communicate that to the rest of the community and let them know what's going on. So there's an example of more experimentation. And then in Kira, in Finland, we have a long-term vision. There's one thing that the Finns are really, really good at, is thinking long-term. So the city of Espoo, which is a city just about 35 minutes from Helsinki, it's also the home of Taviola, which is also an interesting post-war recovery city. If anybody knows their history of recovery, this is probably one of the most interesting. But Kira is their next vision, if you like, of what a circular economy city could look like. And so they've made a long-term plan for how they're going to evolve that plan. Again, it involves around 14,000 homes and so on. So it's not small, it's quite big. But in all these things, you see the vision, you see the important role in land, you see the shaping of purposeful public investment, you see also the accountability and engagement with residents, taking them along the way, involving them, experimenting with them. I'll move on a bit further now, but you get the pattern. And in each of these research projects, we looked at what are all the different kinds of instruments that can be used to shape better, more purposeful markets for circular economy housing. Here we looked at the apartment buildings and the different kinds of strategies, alliances, peer networks, and also dialogues that occurred as well. Here's some examples that were utilised in the report that focused on apartments, which Hazel Ethop was from UNSW was the leader of. And she drew on New Zealand, Scotland. We also talk about the importance of the renovation wave, the way in which even in recovery, even in post-war recovery, they were thinking about what are the things that we should embed in what we want the future to look like. There were 5 areas, 2 of which circular economy and also retrofitting our poorly performing housing stock. Others included digital and renewable energy and so on. So that green vision was also part of recovery, a part of what would a new capitalism look like? What would it be? Of course, it's not something which can be changed overnight. It will fail. It will succeed in some areas. It will have setbacks. We see that even in the FT yesterday. I think there was an article about S&P rolling back ESG assessments of corporations. It's a struggle, but it's one in which is increasingly informed, of which academics are engaged with. We're increased, and in Europe they're funded to do so as well. We also look again at the large-scale retrofit, which of course retrofit was even central as a labour recovery, an employment recovery. Denmark, for example, found that as a key in its housing sphere. It was a key area where it chose to dedicate its revolving fund from the Tenants Fund and the National Building Fund towards retrofitting social and affordable housing. So we see that this is beyond just energy efficiency, but it's actually about a better economy, a more stable economy, more sustainable economy, one which hopefully does less harm. I mentioned the Danish Revolving Fund, which is, I think, a very, very important institutional cog in the wheel, if you like, of an affordable rental system there, in which loans repaid accumulate, continual tenant payments accumulate after those loans are repaid into purposeful funds, a central fund, a local fund, a fund for new construction. This is something we don't have, but other countries do have, which sustains purposeful investment, which doesn't extract surpluses from an affordable housing stock, but reinvests in improving that stock, also in the neighbourhoods of those areas. Again, the inquiry goes right down to the micro scale of materials, and this is a particularly good report, this one, a very strong one. And it involves a good team from RMIT, I have to say. And there again, we see also internationally to draw on the kind of efforts that can be made to specify and to support green materials, circular materials through green procurement. We know the development of the EU taxonomy is also defining how what is circular, what would that mean, how to report on that, how should that be justified. The most recent report released, I think, 2 weeks ago by the European Commission, which is on the metrics of reporting. It's a paper for discussion and engagement with the stakeholders. So the inquiry team is still keeping up with what's going on and changing, and still developing its expertise. So I'd like to hand over back to Ralph to talk about what did this all mean for our strategy.
Thanks, Julie. I'll also keep going probably quite fast. Yeah, I'm not going to go into detail, as I said, but I will just pull out one or two things that I would like to emphasise. As Julie said and has talked across the 4 projects that were undertaken, this inquiry engaged with the idea of circular economy housing at the planning scale or the precinct scale, also with apartments specifically, also with social housing retrofit, and then, as Julie was just saying, with building materials and supply chains. In terms of the planning scale or the precinct scale, there were a number of directions for reform that were identified by the project, and these span, you know, a kind of awareness raising and building of capacity and knowledge and talking about what is a circular precinct, what is circular economy housing at the precinct scale, and what does it mean to the different people involved in the creation of those projects at the precinct scale. But right through into the property-related industries and disciplines. The governance approaches were highlighted as a kind of key area to think about. Partnerships between public-private sector, which are already very active in these precinct developments, can be rethought, and new models considered and practiced and tested. Certainly, finance was identified as a barrier for circular economy precincts. And that suggests this, going back to this point about fiscal settings. So we've in the report, we've actually put together, compiled a set of interventions across each of the 4 quadrants, testing out that word quadrants, in essence 4 areas that are interlocking, but which we feel all need to be progressed in concert. And Hazel's project, the project that Hazel led, Hazel East Hope from UNSW, as Julie said, really focused in on strata, on apartments, and looked at the overarching regulatory framework within which apartments are produced and consumed, but also then went into issues of tenure and which are particularly problematic, of course, just because of the nature of this typology. It means that literally materially stuff is stuck together. It's much harder to change it once it's in place. And of course, there are a variety of other challenges associated with the apartment typology. Again, a variety of measures which I won't talk to, but which are in the reports, both the overarching inquiry and this project report. A project that on social housing retrofit that was co-led by Traves here and Emma from Adelaide, looked at this question of particularly of the role of social housing providers and the fact that at present there are a number of gaps that are really preventing a kind of prima facie opportunity, which is to test, because these social landlords have access to multiple dwellings. There's a prima facie case that, given the right skill, regulatory, fiscal arrangements, multiple dwellings can be retrofitted at the same time for maximum benefit for low income or other households that are otherwise disadvantaged, and that this is a testing ground for wider scale uptake of retrofit. It de-risks, it brings learning rates down, prices down, and so on. Now, this is simple. It's not as simple as it looks, and even in other jurisdictions, there are major challenges where people have been testing and trying this for a while. And I think this project dug into some of those examples. And again, comes up with a set of interventions across each of the 4 quadrants. Finally, then, building materials. As Julie said very politely, this is a large, chunky report. Actually, you said it much better than I did. Beautiful, I think, or something like that. It's very detailed, and again, a raft of kind of measures that are designed to, in concert, promote, if you like, everything that happens around the physical site on which circular economy housing is to appear or be retrofitted, or and so on. So everything that happens before the site, and including, I guess, up to fabrication. Maybe I'll just spin through the recommendations, because I think we're almost there. And really, the overarching inquiry tried to bring this together into kind of what's the path forward for. We were asked to provide the basis for a 10-year strategy. Doesn't sound very imaginative, I know, but that's what we took on. And in essence, using these quadrants, we first of all are, I guess, putting these out there as something to be adopted. They provide 4 important different doors that are interconnecting into the same room, in effect. They provide important different ways of seeing and thinking about shifting housing systems towards circular economy. There's the skills agenda, as Julie said, there's the markets, there's the tilting investment flows and reappraising value, and they are all linked together. The right regulatory settings actually do tilt investment flows in themselves. They de-risk investment in certain types of activities, for example. The second one is to set up a vehicle. Now, of course, in March, when we were finalising the overarching inquiry report, the federal government, almost by osmosis, set up a circular economy task force, but it is not sector specific. It's chaired by John Thwaites, and there's a bunch of people on it that are trying to start gearing up federal Commonwealth government thinking in this space, but not specific to construction, not specific to housing. And of course, I imagine and hope, and I've already made my views known, that a sector approach to housing is absolutely needed, and leadership on that needs to come from the Commonwealth in terms of thinking through that all-important regulatory framework that we've been talking about. But then, there are multiple players, including peak bodies, including industry players, including academics, including training organisations and so on, finance, not least, that need to be in that room and on that journey. We've listed some of them here, some of those sort of key actor groups, and listed some of their responsibilities and roles that they can and should be charged with, resourced for, equipped for, and legitimised in this process. And the fourth recommendation then is to split up the tasks into what I'd call short-term, 1 to 3 years. Like, we need to do this right now. And then in the latter part of that 10-year frame, the sort of strengthening and building measures. So there's a kind of phasing of the toolbox, if you like. And finally, then the testing phase and rolling out phase. I guess that's probably it for today, apart from Louise's piece, which I'm sure you've all really been waiting for. What we wanted to do is think a bit about how we have that conversation about such a large and perhaps even overwhelming set of changes that are required to an industry that everybody feels a close affinity with. Most of us live in housing, but also are also involved in its design, manufacture, and performance in various different ways. So, Louise, over to you.
Thank you, Ralph. Now I've got exactly 1 minute to go through that presentation. So I'll just take maybe 5 or 6 minutes to present really one part of the inquiry, which was maybe the most innovative in a way in terms of outputs and in terms of how we communicate about this. As you would have understood, quite a large research project. And we decided to really take on that recommendation of building capacity. And by thinking of, as a university, how do we go about building capacity? How can we do that within just the scale of that project? And so we decided to sort of bring circular economy housing to life using a graphic novel. So, as I said, we, as academics, we're quite used to producing long and hefty documents, which are very often high level and very time consuming to read. So we realized that if we wanted to sort of communicate all of these findings in a sort of short and sweet way, we needed to do something different. So we developed this as a bit of an experiment. It's not very long. It's black and white because, you know, funding and all of that. But we really wanted to see how we could do better at sort of teaching and communicating about circular economy housing and what it actually looks like. So as an experiment, and I think, Ralph, you were saying it may or may not work, so we would love some feedback from you today in terms of what you think about its relevance, its veracity, and on whether it's effective as a sort of non-traditional research medium. And I should acknowledge that the novel was co-designed by the Inquiry research team. So I went back to every research leader and asked to help co-design the double pages that corresponded to each of the housing fields, and that it was beautifully illustrated by an MIT trained designer, Zhen Song. So why did we do this? Well, we noticed that often, and you probably have noticed that as well, depictions of circular economy are rather abstract. They often don't say very much. They're often a round or a circle thingy with arrows and with leaves on it. So few of these depictions also talk about circular economy housing specifically. So it's not always very helpful. There's not a whole lot of imageries, if you will, to kind of depict what circular economy housing can look like. And of course, as I said, we wanted to communicate our findings in a way that would be accessible to a non-expert audience, which is pretty much everybody. And most importantly, everybody who actually live in the homes that we're talking about. And another aspect was really to explore a more playful and more positive way to think about circularity and to highlight the benefits that it can have on our housing system, and that it is possible to implement change. I just wanted here to quote Dr. Gemma Su, who writes about comics and climate change research, and she writes, "Comics are a powerful way to capture diverse images of still possible and alternative climate futures that move beyond apocalyptic imaginaries to inform debates about the geographies of hope as they relate to climate change. Comics can enhance the participatory nature of research and facilitate a move to a more desired-based research frameworks that emphasize character-driven and anti-essentialist narratives." So it's quite a wordy quote, but it's quite a nice one to capture why graphic novels and comics and other forms of storytelling are really in the rise in the scientific community, increasingly also for climate researchers who are being asked to communicate about their research and who are expected to do so. So it's printed on the poster that you can see on the side. It's also on the screen. The novel is a 10-page grayscale graphic novel based on the research. And the main character is Sam, a builder based in Australia who takes the reader through different spaces, different urban housing spaces, and through the urgency of producing more sustainable housing. So it uses quite a simple but effective drawing style with very specific and precise references to best practice design, construction, and retrofits projects and methods. As you can see here, you would recognize some of the buildings that you would have just seen as photos. So we really try to capture actually existing projects so that people can then go and look for them and learn more. Another example, we wanted to show what a comfortable and sort of energy efficient home looks like by showing multiple generations living together, and looked for the ideal temperature of what, you know, a home should be at. It's 18 degrees in New Zealand and a well ventilated home. So it's really quite precise, hopefully showing, you know, various challenges. To the right of the slide, we tried to show the challenge of, for example, when we think of design for disassembly, where do you store materials in between projects? So we try to capture also the challenges as well as the opportunities. And finally, of course, we wanted to illustrate the quadrant framework that by now you would know very well. And so the final double pages really give a very accessible overview of this framework, which we've previously depicted in kind of very high level terms, but here it's highly accessible. It showcases the various actors and initiatives that can play a role in this transition towards circularity. And so we really wanted with this to really get involved with the practicalities of building circular economy capacity and produce something that would be accessible and hopefully enjoyable to read. So in terms of reach, well, thanks to Julie's location in Poland, we were able to sort of launch this and test it at an international conference in Lodz in June. And so we produced these banners to sort of be able to travel, and obviously we're reusing them. And we want to travel with those and sort of plug them in different spaces so that people can just scan the QR code and access the research, and hopefully you know, have a broader reach using this. And finally, this is just an acknowledgement that we're not the only ones doing graphic novels. There's, as I said, really an increased popularity of using these tools and these mediums. It's done at Monash as well in their digital energy futures. And I've put here also the graphic novel of Gemma, which was an inspiration for this project. So in terms of opportunities, we think that this novel really helps thinking about circular economy in terms of what's possible and what's achievable, and we hope that it will be used in schools and other places, and hopefully read online by many. So I'll stop here because we really want to hear from you and give it back to Ralph.
Thanks, Louise. So yeah, I mean, that's really the formalities over with. I mean, I should say I did start this session with a rather polemic and perhaps rather negative take on the state of Victorian housing regulation. I actually do believe, I'm quite optimistic, I do believe that this shift is eminently possible on a short time frame. But it can't be done by existing markets such as they are, and it can't be delivered by any individual actor. So it does require a collective response and a collective approach, and clear a clear pathway, and then consensus to be built around that vision and pathway. But given that, change could be quite rapid and successful. I see no reason why not. So within a decade is a reasonable time frame. It's just that if we do nothing for the next 5 years and we expect markets to deliver on a basis of household demand, nothing will happen. Nothing will continue to happen. And I think that's really the takeaway, I would say, from the inquiry. So I'm very happy to take questions. If people don't really favour this format of me standing here and you sitting there, we can also at some point move in an organic fashion to where the food is and discuss. I'm standing here between you and lunch is what I'm saying, basically. So does anybody have any questions that they want to raise or comments? I'm particularly interested in any comments on the graphic novel because it's the first time we've done something like this. You can make those comments privately or publicly. Publicly is this is it. Yeah, thanks.
I'm afraid of these things. So I'm working in a JL, so we give the sustainability consultants to the big investor and things. Not really particular in residential apartments, but I think it linked to each other when we're talking about circular economy. Our conundrum currently is how to make a financial business case to show to clients actually they can take on. One example, I went to our office in Sydney last week. It was so beautiful, brand new, well rating file, whatever, right? And the one recycled chair, $6,000. I mean, I don't know how to present these to clients. Say you need to be accept a circular economy when you need to ask them to pay for such a bill. I don't know how, without the regulation, I don't know how I can make it happen. Yeah.
Well, in a sense, at one level, you're reflecting, I think, something that I've been saying, that there needs to be regulation in order to provide the boundaries within which circular economy housing is not an option. It is what we all do. It is normal. It is baseline. That is the first step. While we have $6,000 chairs as the route to circular economy housing, like I said, it's not going to happen. I completely agree with you. It becomes an option that some people will be able to and will want to take up, which is not where we need to be if we want circular economy housing. We need it to be everything is circular economy housing. There isn't an option to opt out of it. And I think once you do that, that $6,000 chair automatically becomes a $600 chair, or maybe, I don't know. So I'm basically agreeing with you. I think that there are multiple logics and value questions in the report that are raised about shifting, and ESG is one of them. So, I know the City of Melbourne is involved in dialogue at the moment. Is anybody? No, nobody from the City of Melbourne? Yeah, that discussion will be continuing. And I think that, businesses that want to rent accommodation, non-domestic accommodation to run their businesses, if they have a concern about the environment, being able to rent a green lease and have an office that really they don't have to worry too much about their own reporting and their own embodied emissions, they are taken care of as part of the package. That's definitely rising demand in that space. So I think there are, but my point would be that this is in the options space, and it is not going to shift fundamentally the market anywhere near fast enough or systematically. That's going to come from, as I mentioned, this regulatory environment. Julie?
Yeah, I mean, the case of Europe is quite pertinent with the directives and how
the most influential shift, reducing carbon emissions by, I think, it's almost 80% since the 1980s. So there's been a huge reduction through purely just having it as requirements. But of course, getting an industry ready or supply chains ready, you see some countries like Austria, through their climate active program, getting involved in shaping the supply chains, shaping the regulatory requirements in their nation more effectively than others, because they stepped in there, their Ministry of Economy stepped in there to focus on supply chains, focus on the regulatory requirements on the Uniform Building Code. They showed real leadership there, and that's why Austria performs so well. But interestingly, of its housing sector, the sector which is the most, the best performing in terms of energy efficiency and also social inclusion and affordability and decent standards of provision, is in fact the limited profit housing and municipal housing company sector, which is around 24% of the country's housing stock. So why is that performing so much better than the very weakly regulated private rental sector there? Is because of the effective use of regulation, but also conditional investment in that sector, which requires the performance. So they've used regulation, they've used conditional investment, but they've also required that it's accountable. So when you receive any form of public subsidy, of course we know our own private rental sector is in fact one of the more deeply subsidised, more deeply than affordable and social sector. So we're not really asking much, are we, from it in the amount of, the 2 to 3 billion a year that we give for negative gearing, etc. So why aren't we, steering and shaping and tilting the way in which we regulate, invest, and make accountable for those subsidies? We can be doing so much more creatively we already shape the market one way. We need to shape it a better way.
Mike.
The housing stock in Australia increases by about 5% a year. So that something like 95% of the housing out there is existing housing, which suggests that the real challenge is coming with your 4-quadrant approach, particularly around retrofitting.
Yeah.
Now, about 70% of house sales each year are existing houses.
Yeah.
So the critical point is when a house changes ownership. Seems to me that strategically, from a policy point of view, it would be really important to focus your 4 quadrants, and particularly the financing and regulatory sharp arrows at that point of the change of ownership. And I suspect that that's where most of the gains are going to happen in a circular economy sense. The 5% of new is where most of the policy has been focused, as you know, around green housing and the various attempts to improve the new stock. But the real problems that we're dealing with is that 95% that we've inherited. It's a huge battleship that's sort of sailing.
Yeah, I mean, needless to say, I agree. Julie?
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's why the certification on sale could be a very useful. Yeah, exactly. So, and that's what they do in the Netherlands too. And I noticed also in Spain, renters, when you look in the windows at the rental real estate, is also what your energy rating is. So soon it could be that you cannot rent a dwelling which is, say, level E. Also the segments approach. So, that ABCD of the certification. So working out, okay, we need to do the most heavy lifting from D to C, for example. So that's where we're going to put our effort in this segment of the housing market. So that kind of thinking that Mike is suggesting is entirely front and centre of what we should be doing in the tilting, shaping, building capacity, approach.
Just to add in there, Mike, yeah, you're right in the sense that we know that pulses of reinvestment or pulsive investment in retrofit do tend to happen around changes in lease and ownership, and that's an opportunity to target with a plan. This is not necessarily an entirely new project, though, that we're talking about. We spend roughly the same order of magnitude of money on the existing housing stock each year as we spend on building new housing. So actually, we're not necessarily we're talking about redirecting an existing, admittedly, it comes from in little, sort of mum and dad savings accounts type of buckets. But that is a big chunk of the annual economic spend. And if that can be... No.
Worst quality, shitty stock that poor people get.
Yeah, of course, the inequalities of this are inescapable, and they're very, very significant. I suppose the point I'm making is that by redirecting what is already an investment flow, we can make a lot of difference to the outcomes in terms of existing housing. And many people are up for it. At the moment, there's just no single source of truth available in Australia about what to do. There's no tool approved that provides, so we are reliant upon, yes, there's a bunch of expertise in the industry, but all of it is sitting in a market where there are incentives and where there are, therefore, interests. So we have multiple market failures, and effectively around information asymmetry. Have I got the terminology right, Mike? But there are a bunch of other things to be said in this space, but you're right, retrofit is the big one. It's the huge one. It's the one that is most gnarly because of the split and splintered ownership arrangements for a variety of different factors. I'm not saying new money is not required, but I'm saying we already have a start. And by addressing the issues Julie's just said around really the disadvantages that social housing landlords experience in the housing space. They don't benefit from those tax breaks of negative gearing, for example. By addressing some of those disadvantages in the system, then our social housing stock could be upgraded much more readily. So I agree. Was there any other hands here?
Well, that just follows what the European Union approved in February, which is by 2030 you can't sell or rent apartments if they're below a certain level of efficiency, energy efficiency. But I just did a they show the calculation for the Italian market, for example. That means that more 60-70% of the houses need to be adjusted, which is already high because, as you mentioned before, in Europe you have every rental, every property you buy, you already have the level of but that also comes from the European Union, the European Commission.
Of course.
So it doesn't come from single governments. Because of lobbies, because the sort of incentives, the political incentive that you have. If I put this pressure on the population, as a government, I'm going to lose votes, I'm going to lose the elections. But if the European Commission does it, I can blame them, And it's a political game at the end. It's the sort of incentive that you put on the plate. If the Australian government does this, given that there's a big gap between the incentive that someone that owns an apartment or owns a house have to be an energy efficiency, and the rental properties, which are just sitting there as a way to make money. What sort of incentive I have to, renovate, make that apartment more efficient? It's just the supply and demand, energy efficiency. And I quote a professor of mine from my master. Environment and climate change is a problem for rich people. Because if I have an apartment I can barely afford to pay a mortgage, I can't upgrade it. Because at the stage of things now, I don't have the money. And what are your thoughts on this? And
agreement. I think the Energy Performance in Buildings Directive is 20 years old now. There's been supporters and detractors. But when I speak to colleagues of mine, whether it's in the UK, which has also implemented this directive, now it's trying to get out of it, of course, and colleagues in mainland Europe, or should I say in Europe? I don't know if the UK is in Europe anymore. I'm a geographer, so I'll probably claim it is, but politically not. I would say people don't understand jurisdictions where there isn't this single source of truth, where there isn't a rating tool, because we demand it of our fridges and washing machines, but we don't demand it of our housing. How preposterous is that? We rely, and it's one of the most heavily popular and relied upon labelling schemes in the world. I've done my own work on this, is the appliance labelling scheme here in Australia. Those stars you see on the fridge when you go to buy a fridge. This is the kind of efficacy that we have, and we've recognised the market failures. We've gone in there, we've fixed them, we've provided independent information on a range of different appliances, and yet the place where these appliances are installed, different story. Go for your life, figure your own adventure. You go and become a trained housing assessor and do it yourself, or find somebody off the internet that might be able to do it, but who knows whether they're really certified or know what they're doing, or they're trying to just sell windows. Who knows? That's the actual kind of situation that we're in at the moment. And I don't think it's anybody's fault except regulation. The level playing field that is provided by the rating scale that you've just talked about provides a way into a variety of other. You at least have a single source of truth to work with. If you want to talk about markets, it addresses a number of market failures. And the point I would make about it is that, yes, there are other so-called split incentives, or whatever we want to call them, between landlords and tenants, and they can be regulated for once we have this database of property condition. We can then use it at the point of sale or lease, as I think Mike was suggesting, would be an appropriate time to do it. We can use it to require landlords to provide decent and circular upgrades to their dwellings when necessary, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a kind of, it's a building block. It's infrastructure. We don't like to think of others driving cars without a roadworthy, or having to work out how fridges work in order to go and buy one. We shouldn't have to do that with housing.
If I can add one last thing, that also connect on the sort of incentive that people have at buying investment properties, because again, I'm familiar with the European market, where I barely see the investment property concept. While here you just buy more properties in depth and you accumulate properties. And again, the interest is against you upgrading and doing the job. And I don't see how the circular economy, given the cost of housing and the cost of maintaining a house, can be implemented if we don't cut on the investment property and we actually incentivize first-home buyers, and we don't give.
There's a lot in what you're saying. Only thing I'll say, and I'll defer to others more expert than me, but when we think about the cost of housing in Australia, we're mostly talking about the cost of land.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm not saying bricks and mortar doesn't cost money. It does, and it's not cheap to build a house, but it's cheaper than it is to buy the land. So we shouldn't get those two conflated. And I think that if you're talking about upgrades, we are talking about trades, bricks and mortar, materiality. We're not talking about land. And those are different issues, both of which need solutions, both of which are part of circular housing futures. But in terms of what we think as being servicing a mortgage, a large chunk of that is servicing the cost of the land, or the price rather of the land, rather than the bricks and mortar per se. I'm conscious that we can continue this discussion, which I'm very happy to do, but there's lunch apparently.
Yes, there's lunch. But it might also, one last thought is about the just transition. So, you know, in Europe, that's also a very strong topic of discussion. Also here in terms of labour change and towards renewable energy and what the implications are for the labour force, for example, in Queensland and so on. But the same thing could be applied to housing. Who pays for unaffordable, expensive to run, not only also to your health. So in terms of that just circular economy for housing, that would mean that we need to change the way in which we value the influence we're having in our policy realm to ensure that that lifts the capacity of those who have the least resources to be able to enjoy that. So we have a notion of, if you like, inbuilt into the circular economy of social justice, and that's something which the Europeans are trying to do through just transition, and they've even put it in their recovery plan as one of the 5 areas. So, you know, let's take a leaf out of their leadership and reflect that on our own discussion, which is happening right now in Australia about rental and about justice for tenants, and, you know, harness that mobilisation, that shift, and say, okay, well, that also includes living in warm, comfortable, future-proof homes that you know, don't rely on expensive and to run the heating systems or leaky roofs and windows. So I think it's a really good point that you raised, but also about what Mike is saying about the bulk of where the problem is, and seeing this idea of tilting and shaping for a purposeful outcome and really taking that to heart with our policy reforms.
Thanks, Julia. I think I'll draw a line under it there. No better place to finish. So I think food is straight through that door there, waiting for you. So thanks again, and we'll continue the conversation standing around whatever there is to eat.